It was a cold, overcast afternoon when 27-year-old Emily Carter vanished without a trace. The last place anyone saw her was outside room 19 of the Bluebird Motel, a rundown roadside inn on the outskirts of Springfield, Missouri. She had been living there with her longtime partner, Jake Miller, and their 3 young children, trying to rebuild their lives after years of chaos. To passing strangers, Emily looked like any young mother struggling to make ends meet, tired eyes, soft-spoken, but always gentle with her kids. Those who knew her well, though, understood the truth. Emily had spent nearly a decade trapped in a violent, controlling relationship that had slowly drained her spirit. Born and raised in a loving family, Emily had once been full of light, a girl who laughed easily and dreamed of becoming a nurse. But that light began to dim the moment she met Jake at age 19. He was charming at first, funny, protective, and ambitious, the kind of man who seemed to fill the room with energy. Her family didn't trust him from the start. They saw the flashes of anger, the possessiveness that surfaced whenever Emily spoke to another man. By the time she realized the danger, it was too late. Jake had already isolated her from her friends and family. The years that followed were filled with fear and broken promises. Neighbors often heard shouting from behind closed doors, but Emily always made excuses. "He's just under stress," she'd say. Her relatives begged her to leave. She tried, more than once, taking the children and staying in shelters, but Jake always found her. Every time, he promised he'd change. Every time, he didn't. In the months before her disappearance, Emily seemed determined to start fresh. She had reached out to a local domestic violence advocate, filed for a protective order, and started looking for apartments. She even began saving money from her job at a nearby diner, keeping it hidden from Jake. Then came February 14th, Valentine's Day. That morning, motel guests recalled seeing Emily helping her kids get ready for school. She waved to a neighbor, smiled briefly, and mentioned she had a busy day ahead. Later that evening, several guests reported hearing a heated argument in room 19, shouting, crying, and the sound of something heavy falling. By the next morning, Emily was gone. Jake told motel staff that she had left him in the middle of the night, taking only her purse. But her car was still in the parking lot, her clothes still in the closet, and her phone turned off. Her mother, Carol, knew immediately that something was wrong. Emily would never abandon her children. She called the police and reported her missing, but Jake appeared calm, too calm. He insisted Emily had run away before and would come back when she was ready. Detectives began questioning everyone at the motel. Several guests confirmed hearing the argument. One woman said she heard a child crying, followed by a man's voice shouting, "You're not leaving me again." Days later, Emily's car was found abandoned near a wooded area a few miles from the motel. Inside were her wallet, ID, and a photograph of her children, folded neatly on the passenger seat. Jake was brought in for questioning. He claimed Emily had stormed out after an argument and that he hadn't seen her since. There were no visible injuries on him, but investigators noted the deep scratches on his forearms. Without a body or solid evidence, police could only hold him briefly before releasing him. For Emily's family, it was unbearable. They spent every day searching, printing flyers, organizing search parties, and pleading for information. Weeks passed. Then months. Meanwhile, the Bluebird Motel carried on with business as usual. Room 19 continued to be rented out. Guests complained of a strange, sour odor that lingered no matter how much air freshener the staff used. The manager brushed it off, blaming old pipes. No one imagined that the truth, the horror of what really happened to Emily Carter, was still inside that very room. By late spring, nearly 3 months had passed since Emily Carter vanished. Her family refused to give up hope, though each passing day made it harder to believe she was still alive. Posters bearing her smiling face clung to telephone poles, their edges curled and faded by rain. Local news stations covered the story less and less, turning instead to newer headlines. But Carol, Emily's mother, continued calling the police almost daily. "You're not looking hard enough," she'd tell them, her voice cracking. "My daughter didn't just walk away." Detective Ryan Porter, the lead investigator, shared her frustration. He had interviewed Jake Miller multiple times and was convinced he knew more than he was admitting. Jake's story never changed. He said Emily left after another argument, that she was unstable, that she had run off before. But his demeanor, the indifference in his voice, the lack of genuine concern, bothered Porter deeply. Jake had since moved out of the motel, taking the children to stay with a friend. He rarely answered calls from investigators and refused further questioning without a lawyer present. Meanwhile, room 19 remained occupied. Travelers came and went, truckers, families, construction workers passing through town. The Bluebird Motel wasn't the kind of place that stayed empty for long. In mid-May, a young couple checked in. By their second night, they began complaining to the front desk about an unbearable smell coming from under the bed. "It's like something died in there," the man told the clerk. The manager, already tired of dealing with similar complaints, reluctantly sent the maintenance worker to investigate. The worker pulled the mattress away from the wall and checked the floorboards. He assumed maybe a rodent had gotten trapped and died inside the frame. As he lifted the corner of the bed base, something caught his eye, a dark stain spreading through the wood. Then, a patch of what looked like decaying fabric. Within seconds, the worker staggered back, gagging. "Call the police," he gasped. "Now." When officers arrived, they cleared the room and taped off the area. The stench was overwhelming. Inside the hollow base of the bed, wrapped tightly in layers of bed sheets and plastic, was the decomposed body of a woman. It didn't take long to confirm what everyone had feared: it was Emily Carter. The discovery sent shockwaves through Springfield. The motel became the epicenter of a media storm overnight. Reporters gathered outside the chain-link fence, their microphones catching snippets of police radio chatter. Locals stopped by just to stare, some whispering prayers, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Detective Porter, who had been at the station when the call came in, arrived on the scene within minutes. The sight inside room 19 would stay with him forever. Emily's remains were badly decomposed, but her clothing matched what she'd been wearing the day she disappeared: a faded blue sweatshirt and black leggings. Around her neck, forensic experts found a length of electrical cable, knotted tightly. It was clear, she hadn't left of her own free will. The motel owner was in tears as officers questioned him. "We cleaned that room dozens of times," he kept saying. "I had no idea." The thought that guests had slept mere inches above her hidden body for months was almost too much to comprehend. Detectives immediately turned their attention back to Jake Miller. He had been the last person seen with Emily, the one who reported her missing, and the man who'd lived in that room for weeks. When police arrived at his new residence, Jake appeared unsurprised. "You found her, didn't you?" he said quietly. He was taken into custody for questioning once again. This time, the evidence was far too strong to ignore. Detective Porter confronted him with the findings: the cause of death, the timeline, the bank transactions made using Emily's card days after she disappeared. Jake sat still, staring at the table. His only response: "You can't prove I did it." But the look in his eyes told a different story, one of guilt, fear, and the realization that his lies were finally collapsing. As news spread, the community that had once pitted him now turned cold. For years, Emily's quiet suffering had been hidden behind closed doors. Now, the entire town knew. For Carol and the rest of Emily's family, the discovery brought both devastation and relief. They finally had answers, but at a cost no mother should ever bear. At the small candlelight vigil held near the motel, Carol stood silently, clutching a photo of her daughter. The crowd was still as she whispered, "I knew she was here all along." The discovery of Emily Carter's body inside room 19 turned what had once been a missing person case into a full-scale homicide investigation. Overnight, the Bluebird Motel transformed from a forgotten roadside stop into a crime scene sealed behind yellow tape and flashing lights. Detective Ryan Porter knew this case had to be handled carefully. The public was outraged, not just at Jake Miller, but at the system that had failed to protect Emily time and time again. People demanded answers. How could a woman be killed and hidden in a motel bed while guests slept above her for months? The coroner's report confirmed what investigators already suspected. Emily had been strangled with a length of black electrical cable, likely taken from a lamp in the room. Her injuries showed signs of a struggle, but there were no defensive wounds on her hands, a detail that suggested she had been attacked suddenly, perhaps while trying to protect her children. The timeline fit too neatly to be coincidence. Emily vanished on February 14. Her bank card was used multiple times over the next 3 days, once at a gas station, once at an ATM, and once at a convenience store. Security footage from those locations showed Jake Miller alone, wearing the same jacket he'd been seen in at the motel. Detectives obtained search warrants for Jake's phone records, financial history, and vehicle. They uncovered text messages between him and Emily in the days leading up to her disappearance, heated arguments, threats, and pleas from Emily begging him to let her go. But what disturbed Porter most were the messages Jake had sent after Emily was already dead. "You'll come crawling back. No one else will ever have you." He had sent those messages to her phone days after her death, likely to make it look as though she was still alive. Forensic specialists spent days examining room 19. They found traces of bleach on the floor, and fragments of plastic that matched the material used to wrap Emily's body. Investigators also learned that Jake had insisted on deep cleaning the room himself after Emily's disappearance, something the motel manager initially thought was a sign of grief. It wasn't grief. It was cover-up. When detectives confronted Jake with the evidence, his composure began to crack. In the interrogation room, under the harsh fluorescent lights, he tried to play the victim. "We fought, yeah. But I didn't kill her," he said, his voice rising. "She was crazy. She left all the time." Detective Porter leaned forward. "Then explain the cable, Jake. Explain the bleach. Explain your fingerprints all over the plastic she was wrapped in." Jake went silent. His eyes darted toward the door. For several long minutes, he said nothing, just stared at the table as if trying to calculate his next move. Then, in a sudden burst of anger, he slammed his fists against the metal surface. "You think you know what it's like living with someone like her? She pushed me too far." The words hung in the air, an accidental confession born from rage. Jake tried to backtrack immediately, claiming he didn't mean it that way, but it was too late. The detectives had what they needed. He was charged with second-degree murder, abuse of a corpse, and fraud for using Emily's bank card after her death. As the news broke, the community's sympathy for him vanished. People who once called him a devoted father now spoke with disgust. The motel became a symbol of everything wrong with the system. How many warning signs had been ignored, how many cries for help had gone unanswered. Emily's mother, Carol, attended every press conference, her grief raw but resolute. She asked for help, she told reporters, her voice shaking. She begged for protection. But nobody listened until it was too late. Advocates for domestic violence victims rallied around her, using Emily's story to demand reform. The Springfield Police Department received harsh criticism for failing to act sooner when Emily first filed her protective order. Meanwhile, Jake Miller sat behind bars, awaiting trial. From his cell, he continued to deny everything. But the evidence, both physical and circumstantial, told a story that was impossible to refute. Detective Porter couldn't shake the image of that motel room, the flickering light, the hollow space beneath the bed where Emily's body had been hidden, and the knowledge that for months, life had gone on above her. The case that began with a woman's desperate fight for freedom had become something far bigger, a story of systemic failure, of love turned to control, and of how silence can kill just as surely as violence. And for Emily's family, the next chapter, the trial, would determine whether true justice would finally be served. The trial of Jake Miller began on a gray morning in early autumn, nearly 2 years after Emily Carter's disappearance. Outside the Greene County Courthouse, crowds gathered behind barricades, holding signs that read "Justice for Emily" and "No More Silence." For many in Springfield, this was more than one woman's story, it was the symbol of a system that had failed to protect so many others like her. Inside, the courtroom was tense. On one side sat Emily's family, her mother, Carol, her sister Lauren, and a few close friends. Their faces were drawn but determined. On the other sat Jake Miller, in a plain gray suit, his hair neatly cut, his expression unreadable. The man who once controlled every aspect of Emily's life now sat motionless, shackled by the weight of his own choices. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Michelle Grant, opened with a simple, devastating statement. Emily Carter tried to leave. Jake Miller made sure she never could. Grant painted a portrait of a woman trapped in fear, trying again and again to break free from the man who vowed to love her. She described the pattern of abuse, the bruises Emily hid with makeup, the restraining orders filed and then withdrawn, the desperate phone calls to friends and family. The jury listened intently as photos were shown on a large screen, images of the motel room, the cable used as a weapon, and the hollow bed frame where Emily's body had been hidden for months. Several jurors averted their eyes. The prosecution's case was built on 3 pillars: physical evidence, digital footprints, and motive. First, forensic experts testified about the evidence found in room 19. The electrical cable matched the one missing from a motel lamp. Jake's fingerprints were on the plug end. Traces of his DNA were found on the plastic used to wrap Emily's body, and bleach residue on his clothes matched samples from the motel floor. Next came the digital evidence, bank records showing that Jake had used Emily's debit card days after her death, and cell tower data placing him near the ATM at the same time. Surveillance footage played before the court showed Jake withdrawing money, his face expressionless under the harsh security lights. Finally, witnesses took the stand, former neighbors, friends, and even one of Emily's co-workers from the diner. Each told stories that painted the same picture: Emily was terrified of Jake, but too scared to leave for good. One friend, voice trembling, recalled Emily showing up at her house weeks before her death, her face swollen and tear-streaked. She said she couldn't take it anymore, the woman testified. She said, "If I disappear, it'll be him." The courtroom fell silent. When it was the defense's turn, attorney Daniel Knox tried to cast doubt. He argued there was no direct witness to the crime, suggesting that Emily might have died accidentally during a fight. He described Jake as a man pushed to the edge, a struggling father who made mistakes but didn't mean to kill. But the jury wasn't convinced. The sheer brutality of the act, hiding her body under a motel bed, continuing to use her bank card, and showing no sign of remorse, was impossible to ignore. The most emotional moment came when Carol Carter was called to testify. Standing just feet from the man accused of killing her daughter, she clutched a small silver cross in her hand. Her voice shook, but she never looked away from Jake. "She was my baby," she said quietly. "She wanted to be free. You wouldn't let her." For the first time, Jake's composure faltered. He lowered his head, unable to meet her eyes. After 3 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. The deliberations lasted less than 2 days. On the second afternoon, as the clock struck 4, the courtroom was called back into session. The air was heavy with anticipation. The foreperson rose, holding a folded sheet of paper. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Jake Miller, guilty of murder in the first degree." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Carol clasped her daughter's hand and wept silently. Jake stared straight ahead, his jaw tightening, as if refusing to hear the words. The judge, his tone solemn, addressed him directly. "Mr. Miller, your actions were deliberate, cruel, and cowardly. You took the life of a woman who only wanted peace. For that, you will spend the rest of your life behind bars." Jake showed no emotion as the sentence was handed down, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Outside, a light rain began to fall as the crowd cheered and cried. Reporters surrounded Carol, asking how she felt. She looked past the microphones toward the courthouse steps, her voice soft but steady. "Justice doesn't bring her back," she said. "But maybe now, she can finally rest." Inside his cell that night, Jake Miller sat alone in silence. For the first time, there was no one left to control, no one to threaten, no one to blame. Only the echo of what he had done. In the weeks following the trial, Springfield began to settle back into its routine, at least on the surface. The news trucks left, the courthouse steps grew quiet, and the crowds that once gathered for vigils slowly dispersed. But for those who knew Emily Carter, life would never return to what it had been. Her family buried her on a bright October afternoon beneath a maple tree in Greenlawn Cemetery. The leaves had begun to turn, red and gold against a crisp blue sky. It was the kind of day Emily would have loved. Her children, too young to fully understand, placed white roses on the casket as her mother whispered a prayer. Detective Ryan Porter stood near the back, hands in his pockets, watching in silence. He had handled dozens of homicide cases in his career, but this one had left a mark. Emily's photo, that soft smile, those tired eyes, still sat on his desk at the precinct. He'd promised Carol that her daughter's story wouldn't be forgotten. For Carol, the months that followed were a blur of grief and quiet strength. She became an outspoken advocate for domestic violence victims, speaking at local shelters and town meetings. "The system failed my daughter," she said at one event. "But maybe it won't fail the next one." Her words resonated. Within a year, Springfield established a new domestic violence response unit, the Carter Initiative, providing quicker intervention for women in danger. Jake Miller was transferred to the Jefferson City Correctional Facility to serve his life sentence. The man who once controlled every moment of Emily's existence now lived under the same fluorescent lights and rigid schedule he had forced on her. He refused interviews, never apologized, and kept mostly to himself. Prison guards described him as quiet, polite on the surface, but cold underneath. His fellow inmates called him the Motel Man, a grim nickname that followed him wherever he went. To them, he wasn't a mystery. He was a warning. Meanwhile, the Bluebird Motel struggled to erase its dark past. The room where Emily's body had been found was gutted and remodeled, but the new owners eventually shut the entire building down. Locals avoided driving past it. Truckers who stayed there before whispered stories about hearing strange noises, footsteps above empty rooms, the faint sound of a woman crying. Whether superstition or guilt, no one could say. Emily's children were taken in by her sister, Lauren. She moved them to another town, hoping to give them a chance at a normal childhood, one not shadowed by tragedy. They kept their mother's memory alive through small rituals, lighting candles on her birthday, visiting her grave each Christmas, telling stories about how she used to dance in the kitchen when she thought no one was watching. Lauren once found her niece, barely 8 years old, sitting by the window holding one of Emily's bracelets. "Do you think Mommy can see us?" the girl asked softly. Lauren smiled through her tears. "I think she sees everything, sweetheart. Especially you." The case remained a topic of conversation in Springfield for years. Teachers discussed it in classrooms when talking about healthy relationships. Churches held support meetings for women living in fear. The words "if you see something, say something" were printed on posters around town, a message born from Emily's silence, turned into a promise to protect others. Detective Porter eventually transferred to the domestic violence unit Carol had helped create. He carried a worn notebook filled with names of women he'd met on similar paths, each one a reminder of how thin the line was between survival and tragedy. Sometimes, when the nights were long and the station quiet, he'd flip through Emily's file. Not out of morbid curiosity, but because he wanted to remember her not just as a victim, but as a woman who tried, over and over, to live free. In a rare interview years later, Carol said something that stayed with everyone who heard it. People think Emily's story ended in that motel room. But it didn't. Every woman who finds the courage to leave, every child who learns that love isn't supposed to hurt, that's her story too. Springfield began to heal, slowly, cautiously. But for those who had known Emily Carter, her absence remained, not as an open wound, but as a quiet ache, a reminder of the cost of ignoring the signs of danger. And somewhere in the pages of her case file, beneath all the evidence and police reports, was a single photograph, Emily standing in sunlight, her children in her arms, smiling. That's how her family chose to remember her, not as the woman who died in room 19, but as the one who kept fighting for freedom until her last breath. Years passed, yet the memory of Emily Carter lingered like a shadow over Springfield, not the kind of shadow cast by tragedy, but one born from remembrance and change. Her story had become more than a headline, more than a court case. It was a movement. In the years following Jake Miller's conviction, local lawmakers introduced what became known as Emily's Law, legislation focused on improving the enforcement of restraining orders and providing emergency housing for domestic violence survivors. The law required faster police response times and stronger penalties for those who violated protective orders. It passed unanimously. For Carol Carter, watching her daughter's name etched into that bill brought bittersweet comfort. She often said she didn't want Emily remembered only as a victim, she wanted her remembered as a voice for others who couldn't speak. She wasn't weak, Carol said in an interview on the 5th anniversary of Emily's death. She was tired. There's a difference. Each February, on the week of Emily's disappearance, the local domestic violence shelter hosted a candlelight walk through downtown Springfield. Hundreds joined, survivors, advocates, officers, and families. They carried photos of lost loved ones and signs that read, "Love shouldn't hurt." Carol always led the walk, holding a single white candle. Among those who attended every year was Detective Ryan Porter. By then, he had retired from the police department, but he never missed a memorial. He'd stand quietly near the back, watching the flickering candles move through the streets like a river of light. He no longer saw Emily's photo only in his case file, now, he saw her reflected in every woman who found the courage to start over. The Bluebird Motel no longer existed. A new building stood in its place, a women's outreach center named the Carter House, funded partly through donations from the community. Its mission was clear, to give refuge, safety, and a fresh start to anyone trapped in an abusive situation. On its front wall hung a small plaque that read, "In memory of Emily Carter, whose strength inspired hope in others." Inside, the atmosphere was warm, bright murals, laughter from children, the smell of coffee in the kitchen. Carol volunteered there weekly, helping new residents fill out job forms or find legal aid. She said it helped her heal. This, she often told visitors, is what Emily would have wanted. Jake Miller remained in prison for the rest of his life. Reports said he never sought parole, never spoke at any hearings. Over time, even his name faded from public conversation. There were no visitors, no letters, no legacy left behind. In the end, the man who once controlled everything ended up forgotten, a ghost of his own making. Emily's children grew up far from Springfield, raised by their Aunt Lauren in a quiet town near the Ozarks. They rarely spoke about the past, but as they grew older, they began to learn who their mother really was, not through newspaper clippings or police reports, but through stories. Stories about her kindness, her laughter, and the way she always tucked handwritten notes into their lunchboxes that said, "Be brave. Be kind. Be you." When Emily's oldest son turned 18, he visited his mother's grave for the first time alone. He stood there for a long time, his hands in his pockets, the autumn wind rustling through the trees. "You don't have to worry anymore, Mom," he said quietly. We're okay. In Springfield, the Carter name came to represent something powerful, not pain, but perseverance. Schools began including domestic abuse awareness in their health programs. Police officers received specialized training. Shelters that once struggled now had more funding and volunteers than ever before. The ripples of Emily's life, and death, reached farther than anyone could have imagined. On the 10th anniversary of her disappearance, the town gathered again for a memorial at the Carter house. Candles lit the front steps, and soft music played in the background. Carol, her hair now silver but her spirit unbroken, addressed the crowd. She was just one woman, she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. But she changed everything. Because when people finally started listening, really listening, to stories like hers, something in this town woke up. As dusk settled, the crowd fell silent. The names of other victims were read aloud, each followed by the ringing of a small brass bell. When Emily's name came, the bells seemed to echo longer, as if even the air itself remembered her. The night ended in quiet reflection, candles glowing against the dark, flickering like small promises. Emily Carter's story began as one of love and control, of fear and silence. But it ended as a story of awakening, of a community that learned to see what it once ignored. And though the woman herself was gone, her strength remained, in the shelters she inspired, in the lives she helped save, and in the soft light of every candle lit in her name. Even in her darkest moments, Emily Carter never stopped trying to find freedom. And in doing so, she gave that freedom, at last, to others.